we're going to move out of executive session and move into public hearing on Senate Bill 5107. And staff, would you please brief the bill?
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, Brandon Popovac, staff to the committee. The hearing today is on the proposed substitute to Senate Bill 5107, which is S-0653.1, addressing homelessness. The proposed substitute removes a provision from the original bill that would have created a new misdemeanor of unauthorized camping. Just go into what the bill does. It requires every county and city with a population of over 50,000 to establish and operate at least one emergency overnight shelter site in its respective jurisdiction, and requires the county and those cities within the same geographic boundary to coordinate to ensure there are enough cumulative shelter beds to accommodate at least the number of sheltered and unsheltered portions of the county's most recent point-in-time homeless count. The bill would also require these new shelters to prohibit the possession and use of alcohol and unprescribed drugs on its premises, contingent upon evaluation for and compliance with any recommended treatment. It would require shelters to provide for a police presence during operating hours and also make available employment, mental health, and drug counseling services on site. Lastly, it provides that any new emergency overnight shelter is eligible for assistance under the Housing Trust Fund. Fiscal note has been requested, and with that, I'll conclude my remarks, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions for staff? Senator Lovelett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So is the bill silent as to who is going to be paying for this extra police presence? Just trying to get a sense, if we're looking at the fiscal just for the state, do we have any kind of sense of what that's going to cost on the local level?
That hopefully should come out in the local fiscal note, which has not been supplied yet, so I don't have any numbers yet.
Any other questions for staff? All right, Senator Fortunato, would you like to tell us about your bill?
Right. Thank you, Madam Chair, for bringing this to a hearing. I really appreciate it. And to address Senator Lovett's concern, any costs that are associated with this are supposed to be accessible through the Housing Trust Fund to help offset any cost to local jurisdictions. As you know, there was a court case called Morris versus Boise, when the city of Boise attempted to remove homeless people from the streets or public areas, campground or parks, etc. And the court ruling basically said, you cannot remove homeless people unless there is a place for them to go. So the purpose of this bill is to establish a place for them to go. Now, one of the concerns, especially among homeless people, is security. So, you know, he said, okay, we're going to have a fenced in area. We're going to provide you with a shelter. And that's, in this case, the shelter we're thinking of is simply, you can provide a tent and a sleeping bag. We're going to have a police presence. And the fence is not to keep people in. The fence is to keep people out. Homeless people have to be able to work their way out of homelessness by being able to perhaps get a job and leave their possessions at a place and know that those possessions are going to be secure. We also want to have an ability to provide that counseling services, that drug and alcohol treatment, which is the key to trying to solve this homeless crisis. If we don't address drug and alcohol treatment, we're not really moving in a forward direction to help solve the homeless problem. So with consulting with Madam Chair, we did remove the misdemeanor for unauthorized camping. So one of the criticisms of this bill is that, quote, it criminalizes homelessness. That was not the intent. The intent is to be able to provide safe sidewalks and parks where we're having children find needles and things like that. So by providing this secure area and allowing them to remove people from community parks or from the sidewalk, to me it is not compassionate to have people sleeping in cardboard boxes and on sides of roads and in campgrounds and public parks, disrupting the use of that public facility for other members of the community. So that's the intent of the bill. So I see from the people that signed in, we got a great number of people that are signed in con, and I'm assuming that that number of people that signed in con are opposed to, quote, the criminalization of homelessness, which is not the intent of this bill, and it has been removed in the substitute. So I'm open to any suggestions on how we can improve this, but the intent is to allow a city or county to remove people from a public sidewalk, the sidewalks in Seattle, disrupting business, et cetera, remove them from city parks. And again, hopefully, because we're having this drug usage and needles and things like that, causing the parks to not be able to be usable by other members of the community, and to provide them with a secure area and some counseling and drug treatment and mental health evaluation, so that they can actually work their way out of homelessness and become productive members of society. So with that, I'm hoping that the many people that have signed in con will change their vote to pro and help solve this homeless crisis. So thank you, Madam Chair, for bringing this to a hearing.
Thank you, Senator Fortunato. And I do appreciate you removing the criminal penalty for being homeless. I will say, I agree with you that it's not compassionate that people live in cardboard boxes in America. I think the fact that we have as millions of people who are homeless across this country is a moral failure of this country, quite frankly. And I think that we can and should do better. Every white paper I have read has said the housing first model works. And every paper I've read since the pandemic has hit says that the congregate shelter model has failed. And it also says that requiring people who are homeless to become instantly, or to go cold turkey instantly, there's a much higher rate of failure of that, because anyone who has known someone who has sadly had an addiction problem knows that that's not a linear line out of it. There are a lot of fallbacks and relapses, and it's in and out of sobriety until you finally get there. So my question to you as the prime sponsor is, how does this model address the fact that the pandemic has revealed that the congregate shelter model is a failure and we need to move from that? And are you willing to remove the provision on prohibiting possession and use of alcohol and unprescribed drugs on the premises? I like the idea of the permanent supportive housing services that you require, because I think that is a model that has been proven successful. But are you willing to do that? And how do you envision your congregate shelter model working in a post-pandemic world?
Well, I think when you talk about, the prohibition of drugs and alcohol, I have a serious problem with taking taxpayer money and funding somebody's drug and alcohol addiction. However, I'm not an expert on drug and alcohol counseling or the programs that they go through. I just want that person to have that drug and alcohol counseling available. So whatever that treatment is. I mean, they're the experts. I'm not the expert. I don't pretend to be an expert. I don't pretend to say, my thought is I don't want drugs and alcohol, but if the treatment program says that it's a transitional thing to wean them off of drugs and alcohol, I would rely on that program. So as long as they're, enrolled in a program or moving in that direction, that's the intent. So that's the plan. And, in order for somebody to get out of homelessness, they need to have an income. They need to have a job. They need to have a purpose. So, in my past life, I was doing things that dealt with people. Woman she had a $600,000 condo in Bellevue. She was making mega bucks. She became drug addicted, and she wound up dying on the streets. So she went from having a $600,000 condo to basically living under a bridge and dying at the age, I think she was 47 or something or other, under a bridge because of drug addiction. So if we can move in the direction of providing that drug and alcohol counseling and whatever that program is, I don't know what it is, whatever it works, whatever is the best program that works, we just want to make that available to these people. And hopefully they will then be able to have a secure location. So that's the purpose, have a secure location where they can leave their stuff and not have it be stolen and things like that, where they may be able to actually go out and get a day job and come back and their stuff is still going to be there. And by doing so, they would be able to work their way into a more transitional, a more traditional housing, subsidized housing model and things like that, because now they have an income. That's the purpose. So it's not, I don't pretend to be an expert on drug and alcohol treatment. I don't pretend to be an expert on this, but I do know that if you provide them a secure shelter, a secure place for them to put their stuff, that and sanitation available, that they will be able to become more productive members of society. And that's the purpose. So it's not to criminalize homelessness or any of that stuff. So thank you for those questions. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Senator Short.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is, I love the discussion that we're having on this issue. And the thing that I might be inclined to ask the chair and members of the committee, you know, it seems like, you know, obviously people are concerned with this bill, but maybe an opportunity to have a pretty in-depth work session to, Madam Chair, maybe to bring forward some of the information you've read, but to also allow tiny communities and things like this that are already doing work to address both homelessness and drug addiction. But then I'd like to also bring forward, you know, the chance to hear from the Union Gospel Mission in Spokane. They're what you consider to be a congregate setting, but their model has been, you know, as a tool. I'm not saying it works in every instance, Madam Chair, but they have done tremendous work in both dealing with homelessness, with addiction, and allowing people to gain job skills to get themselves out of the crisis mode that they see themselves in. And I think it'd be a really unique opportunity. I'd just like to suggest that maybe we do that in the future, Madam Chair.
Thank you. That sounds like an excellent suggestion. Senator Loveland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be sending out a link to committee members about other models around the state that address similar issues and have already been established as being very productive model.
Great. Thank you, Senator Loveland. All right. With that, we're going to move into public testimony. We do have 15 people signed up to testify in about half an hour to get it done. So we would like to start with the following three: Ted Kelleher from the Department of Commerce, Dan Swanson and Thomas Bernard, and on deck, Juliana Rowe, Raylene Schifano, and Dan Wise. And there have been 46 people signed in, not wishing to testify, 7 pro and 439 con. All right. There's Ted. Ted, why don't you go ahead and start? Remember that we do have kind of short time, but.
I'll try and go quickly. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I am Ted Kelleher and I manage housing assistance at the Department of Commerce. Thank you for bringing forward a proposal that speaks to the need for a statewide data-driven expansion of housing at a scale that leaves no person living outside. It is not okay to leave over 10,000 people living outside every night. Every Washingtonian deserves a dignified place to sleep. But there has not been the focused commitment of resources to local governments and commitment to ensure siting of housing necessary to move everyone into an appropriate place. As a result, thousands live outside on public property in unsafe conditions. During the last session, the governor worked with the legislature to launch a statewide sheltering initiative that offered every county and larger city in the state funding to open new, dignified, accessible shelter beds. Despite the pandemic, 25 local governments took on the challenge and are opening more than 1,000 beds. These beds are funded under a simple funding formula, reimbursement of up to $56 per day per bed, with up to $10,000 of pre-occupancy costs. This flexible funding structure has allowed local governments to be creative in how they create beds, including leasing motels in Benton County, building tiny homes in Pierce County, Conestoga huts in Walla Walla, and classroom-style portables in Yakima. And we have a report on that if you want to see more details. Adding to this flexible approach, the governor's proposed $70 million in the new budget and capital funding to quickly acquire and put into service existing buildings such as motels. These flexible, lower cost and fast approaches are an important supplement to the more traditional path to add housing. We appreciate this proposal systematic approach to capacity everywhere. There are some significant concerns. The bill references the Housing Trust Fund as a financing source. This is capital funding. It's currently oversubscribed, and it can't be used for ongoing operating costs, which are a significant portion of what it takes to open one of these facilities. When we look at local government finances, they don't have the current resources or taxing authority to fund shelter at the scale required in this proposal, even if they aggressively reallocated existing resources. And finally, we're concerned that the shelter requirements in this proposal may make the beds effectively not accessible under the Martin v. Boise legal standard. The law is not resolved in that area, but I think that's something important to look at. Again, we thank the bringing forward an idea to systemically house people statewide, and we're available to work to craft a proposal that could work. I'm available to answer questions.
All right, thank you, Ted. Do we have any questions for Ted? Senator Fortunato.
In my t-shirt. So Ted, why do you think that this does not meet the Martin versus Boise requirements?
Again, I'm not a lawyer, and I think the law is unresolved in this area, but I think looking at what's known, and I would encourage everyone to maybe some deeper dig into this with local governments who are dealing with the legal issues on a day-to-day basis. But the reading of it in terms of requiring treatment, which it's unclear whether this bill does or not, that may make the shelter effectively not accessible according to the courts, and therefore the local government wouldn't be able to realistically say that the person has to go there if there's a requirement that they're not able to meet. Again, the law is unclear, but.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ted. Juliana Rowe.
Good morning, Senator Cooter, members of the committee. My name is Juliana Rowe, and I'm here on behalf of the Washington State Association of Counties and the Association of County Human Services to convey our opposition to this bill. While it is well intended, it is also untenable for many reasons. The bill sets forth a variety of unfunded mandates for counties. The unfunded mandate statute for your reference is RCW 43-135-060. First, the bill requires that this be paid out of Housing Trust Fund money, as Ted said, that this is not adequate to compensate every city and county required to establish these homeless shelters. And the bill does not increase the funding for the Housing Trust Fund. And so it is increasing costs for counties without fully reimbursing them. Second, the bill requires that shelters must accommodate for at least the number of people in the county's most recent point in time homeless count. And while this is a noble goal, without an increase in funding, counties will have no way of providing this service. Again, another unfunded mandate without reimbursement. Third, the bill prohibits the possession of alcohol and drug use on its premises. This policy would be contrary to what have been proven low barrier and housing first strategies to assist those with substance use disorders. This will simply result in a portion of those needing help to not use these shelter beds. Fourth, the bill requires that the shelters provide police presence during the shelter's operating hours. This new requirement will likely deter many from participating in the shelter program. Further, it would be prohibitively expensive and an unfunded mandate without state reimbursement. And finally, the bill requires counties to, quote, require and make available, unquote, employment, mental health, and drug counseling services at each location. I will point out that Commerce has a policy that shelters should not be conditional on participating in these types of services. And it is also a new service or program that the state is not reimbursing in this bill. I will take any questions you have for me at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Any questions for Juliana? All right, moving on to Raylene Schifano. Welcome, Raylene.
Welcome. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have some concerns with the bill. I was one of those that didn't want to see homeless being criminalized, so I appreciate that being removed. But you have 5 major cities in King County alone that would need to increase their homeless shelters, and I don't see that being possible. We have over 11,000 people that are homeless in King County right now, and only around 6,000 are using the shelters. So we have a huge population that aren't already using these shelters, and we need to figure out how to get those people to use the shelters that we are providing. And the other thing was the Seattle Human Services is having a hard time staffing these shelters already. And now we're adding medical professionals and police officers, and who is going to staff these? You know, they're already having a hard time staffing the ones that were set up for the COVID. So that is another concern. I have a lot of concerns. I do want to be a part of, I will help come up with ideas about keeping people from going homeless in the first place, getting people to ask for help before they go homeless. I think the state would be better off trying to keep people in their homes than having a home for them to go to. So I do want people sheltered. I don't want them living on the streets, but I just think there's something that we could do. The other thing that I saw was that there's a lot of discrimination with the religious shelters against the LGBTQ community. And that needs to be taken into consideration also, that we are not allowing discrimination because of people's beliefs. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any questions for Raylene? Okay, before we go to our next panelist, I'm going to call up Melanie Smith, Michelle Thomas, and Emma Jones. And Dan Weiss, why don't you unmute yourself and please proceed.
Hello, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Dan Wise, and I'm the Deputy Director of Catholic Community Services of King County. I'm here to express strong concerns about proposed Substitute Senate Bill 5107 and urge that it not pass out of committee. Catholic Community Services operates about 600 beds of shelter in King County and almost 700 units of affordable housing. We have a large presence in both King County and South King County. Through this experience, I can say that as written, the bill creates barriers to getting people off the streets. For example, it requires that people in poverty be monitored by police if they're trying to access a shelter. If it's our goal to truly lessen the number of people experiencing homelessness in our community, then we should be discussing bills that create housing. This bill as written would likely result in the unintended consequence of leading people in poverty into jails. And I will say as an aside that you do not have to resolve somebody's income in order to resolve their homelessness. The problem of homelessness and the problem of deep poverty are separate and have separate solutions. I've worked in managed shelter for over 2 decades. Our programs are in your communities. We work with many of the faith-based leaders in the area. I'd welcome the chance to discuss opportunities to look at policy changes, and I just urge you not to pass Senate Bill 5107. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have any? We do. Senator Fortunato. You're on mute, Senator Fortunato.
Sorry, I forgot my t-shirt. The purpose of the police presence, Dan, is not to keep people in. It's not to be a deterrent. The purpose of a police presence is to provide security. And the security that has come up is basically homeless camps being invaded by drug dealers and sex traffickers. So that's the purpose. So it's not to grill anybody or charge them with some kind of criminal charge. It's just to provide security so they have a safe place to go. So, if you have any feedback, I'd like to talk to you further about it. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, I guess I will just quickly say that there's a disproportionate number of BIPOC people of color in homelessness, and we know that the BIPOC community in relation to police presence in their community has large historical issues associated with systemic racism. And so we cannot say that you can disconnect one from the other and just dictate a police presence in a shelter and expect that people will access that resource.
Thank you.
Thank you. Melanie Smith.
Good morning or good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I'm Melanie Smith here representing the Seattle-King County Coalition on Homelessness today. And we do have some concerns about Senate Bill 5107. I'm really grateful to Senator Fortunato and others for removing the criminalization language that was included, and we are more pleased with the proposed substitute. But we do still have some deep concerns about this language. I think we all agree that we need to find a better, more effective way of helping folks that are currently homeless transition into more stable and permanent housing. And I think we also agree that more capacity is needed in this system. We need more capacity, and we unfortunately need a lot more funding. But Senator Cruder, I think you nailed it exactly squarely on the head. The evidence from the last 20 years is that no and low barrier housing in a housing first model is absolutely the best way to get people into shelter and then to transition them into permanent housing. And we've learned so much through the pandemic. We've learned from the red line in Renton that folks who previously were in a congregate setting are thriving in that more individualized and respectful and humane way of living. And so I think taking what we've learned about housing first, taking what we've learned about the most effective ways to treat substance use disorder and treat other behavioral health conditions in a way that will really truly engage people in recovery, this is maybe not the best way to move forward. And so I would encourage you to look at other legislative proposals that are certainly being discussed. I think we all agree that we need more capacity and more funding, and focus on things that will really engage people into their own recovery and their own housing. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Melanie? All right, and before we go to our last panelist, I'm going to call up Christian Martinez, and thank you, Melanie, Brianne Schuster, and John Rios, and next we'll have her from Michelle Thomas.
Hi, my name is Michelle Thomas with the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance, here to testify on Senate Bill 5107. Before I address our concerns with this bill, I do want to acknowledge that we want more conversation on the solutions to homelessness, and we appreciate Senator Fortunato that you've attempted to put forward an idea. Unfortunately, though, the bill's flawed and not based on best practices that homeless service providers have learned. And unfortunately, it does nothing to address the systemic underlying reasons that homelessness is persistent in Washington state. And it does nothing to address the very real threat of homelessness increasing this year due to the economic recession and the looming end of the state's eviction moratorium. The bill also doesn't do anything to help pay for the shelter expansion that it requires, as you have already heard from others. The Housing Trust Fund can already be used to build or acquire shelter, but that program is underfunded. We want conversation on productive, real solutions. Real solutions include significantly increasing our investments in affordable housing right now. People are unable to exit shelter because there is no housing for them to move into. Permanent supportive housing in particular is needed. This is housing that includes services that support the housing, the medical, and behavioral health needs of people with complex disabilities and long experiences of homelessness. We want to have a conversation to significantly increase the investments in permanent supportive housing, because that is our state's solution to our extreme homelessness crisis. We want more shelter too, but it will not materialize without state investments. As Ted already noted, the governor's capital budget included funding for the Housing Trust Fund, but also for shelter capacity grants and for a fund to rapidly acquire properties that are newly available due to the recession, such as hotels and motels that can be used to expand shelter capacity. Lastly, I want to note that the federal government has very recently greatly increased the FEMA rules, or eased the FEMA rules, to allow states to invest in homelessness shelters and get 100% reimbursement for those investments. I think the state should immediately look into this to expand shelter capacity, and I'd be happy to work with you, Senator Fortunato, or with any other member of this committee to get FEMA funds into the state now so we can expand shelter and get 100% reimbursement. Thank you.
I'm happy to work with you on that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Any questions for Michelle? Okay, thank you. We're going to move next to Brianne Schuster and John Rios. If you would turn on your video, please. And we'll call up next David Moser and Yael Sophia Espinoza. Go ahead, Brianne.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Brianne Schuster, a staff attorney at the ACLU of Washington, here also to testify in opposition to SB 5107. One of the reasons housing is a civil liberties and civil rights issue for us is because throughout much of this country's history, racially discriminatory and exploitive practices have displaced Black, Indigenous, and people of color from their homes and prevented them from accessing one of the primary ways in which Americans accumulate wealth, home ownership. Though such racial restrictions have since been declared unconstitutional, they continue to contribute to the wealth, income, and housing disparities we see today. As we're all aware, Washington is likely facing one of the most severe housing crises in our country, or in our history, where already countless residents have been displaced from their homes and forced into emergency shelters, vehicles, tents, and other makeshift shelters on public property. Absent swift intervention, tens of thousands of more Washingtonians are at risk of eviction in the upcoming months. We appreciate that this bill is introduced under the guise of attempting to help such constituents, but the reality is that it's rooted in widely debunked theories that people living on the streets are simply not ready yet for housing. The solution to rising and unaffordable rents is not denying people access to a roof over their head because of alcohol or drug use. This only perpetuates systemic inequities and exacerbates substance use disorders and concurrent mental health issues. The solution is also not pervasive policing of the homes where poor people live, who are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Such broken windows policing has been also widely debunked and similarly shown to amplify inequities. We also know that our houseless neighbors are far more likely to be victims of crimes than perpetrators. SB 51-7 does not approach this crisis with evidence-based solutions like a housing first approach, but instead imposes a cruel punishment for what should be treated as a public health, economic justice, and human rights issue. The ACLU of Washington opposes SB 5107 and urges you not to pass it because it includes ineffective, unfair, and biased conditions regarding who among us deserves a roof over our head. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Senator Fortunato has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Brianne, the purpose of this bill is to simply get people off the street. That's the purpose. So it's not, on the other side of the spectrum, I hope you're going to come in and speak favorably on my American Dream Homes bill, which is an attempt to provide people a home of their own. And the object is to move people out of apartments into houses, from subsidized apartments to market rate house apartments, and from shelters into subsidized apartments, and from the streets into shelters, pardon me. So everybody here is in agreement we need to provide housing for people. The question comes in is, these people are living in cardboard boxes on the street. And that's just trying to get them off the street and provide them with some secure location. And again, I guess police presence might be a little bit more, we'll have to look at it, but the concern is that they have security for their stuff, that they could leave their stuff, go out, come back, and it'll still be there. And that's the purpose. So it's not any discriminatory thing or any of that kind of stuff. So I look forward to working with you on some kind of proposal or look at this. And Madam Chair will do a work group and we'll try to figure this out. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Fortunato. Mr. Moser.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you, committee, for your time. My name is David Moser, and I'm a public health and behavioral health worker in King County, where I've worked in shelter and emergency housing systems for over 20 years. And I'm also an instructor in the social work program at Seattle University, where I teach classes on our homelessness crisis and current best practices for working with our unsheltered and unhoused neighbors. Today, I'm testifying against Senate Bill 5107 because it includes extremely counterproductive language that contradicts these best practices. To require shelters to ban the possession of alcohol and unprescribed drugs is to implement a punitive approach toward those with substance use disorders and addiction struggles. And this is directly contrary to decades of research and hard-won on-the-ground experience of behavioral health and public health practitioners nationwide. For a shelter to work as an alternative to the streets, it needs to be low barrier and accessible and welcoming to everyone, not just those who are deemed worthy. These restrictive requirements are counter-therapeutic, not trauma-informed, and they are directly contrary to evidence-based practices of housing first and harm reduction. What we know works is meeting people where they are at and providing voluntary options that honor their volition and their uniqueness, their agency, and their humanity. Treating adults in crisis like children needing scolding never ever works to get the deep personal buy-in that you need for real steps to health and stability to occur. Housing first principles work, and they save public money. Cities must provide shelter that is accessible to everyone, not just those who meet a narrow definition of deservingness and readiness. Please follow the evidence and the spirit of Martin versus Boise. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Moser? All right, thank you. Mr. Rios. You're on mute, Mr. Rios.
Okay, is that better?
That's better.
Okay, fantastic. Obviously, I think I was here really initially to speak about the criminal penalty portion of it, of all this. However,
I'm sorry, Mr. Rios, could you identify yourself for the record, please?
Yes, I'm sorry. My name is John Rios. I'm a mental health case manager. I work for DESC downtown, dealing with folks that are in a lot of these conditions that we're speaking of today that have co-occurring disorders. So again, initially I wanted to speak about the criminal penalty portion of this, but it sounds like that's been removed. However, as it's written, I still have a lot of complications with how this bill is worded. I think that even though we might remove that criminal penalty, it's still going to be something that's very much demonized. And we've seen in a lot of situations where displacement of homeless individuals is still happening. We're still having sweeps all over the state, and this is a very detrimental to their health and the work that a lot of us as service providers do. This displacement makes it really difficult when we're dealing with, of course, the middle of a pandemic, of trying to keep track of folks, and also when we're dealing with outbreaks of communicable diseases. And so I'm just worried about like this advancing and still kind of creating that atmosphere of like this still being allowed. I really want to say thank you to everybody that spoke before me. There's a lot of, I think everybody really said a lot of great stuff. David, I think Juliana really hit the nail on the head, and Raylene really mentioned some part of the issues that we're dealing with, and that's just the pure issue of staffing shelters and getting enough staff into all these locations in the permanent supportive housing units that we have already and everything. And so I feel horrible about moving forward with this without seeing some sort of clear funding for these things put into place before. Again, as David said, we really have to meet people where they're at, and the idea of having police presence or disallowing alcohol or drug possession within these shelters or these areas becomes a barrier to people actually seeking those services, and really works against what the nature of this bill is trying to get at. And so I think that that's a bad idea to go forward to. And also, I just want to, have everybody remind everybody that not everybody has the ability to work at the end of the day. The people might just need housing and everything, and that's not going to be the situation for everyone. There's still a lot of people that are unhoused that have severe mental health issues or physical abilities and disabilities which don't allow them. So I want you to keep that in mind when we're kind of talking about this issue. Other than that, I really don't have much more else to say. It seems like everybody did a really great job, so I appreciate all the people that came before me.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Rios, with the understanding we have one panelist left and 5 minutes to go? All right, thank you. All right, Yale Sophia Espinosa, welcome. Please identify yourself for the record and begin.
Hello, everybody. For the record, I am Yael Sophia Espinosa. I am an audio journalist and a political economist for Chop Shop Economics. And I would firmly like to testify against this bill. In Senator Fortunato's own words about how he has described the shelters, and I use the word shelter very, very lightly. He has described it as fenced off, a secure location, patrolled and monitored by police in order to be secure from drug dealers and sex traffickers. Often words are used as like dog whistles in order to stigmatize people of color and sex workers. And apparently this work is supposed to be, make homeless people all throughout the great state of Washington it is supposed to make them productive and free. I would like to read a definition of what this could, be constituted as. In the UK, there is a long history of what is called the poorhouse. Thankfully, it was abolished. But the poorhouse was a way of forcing poor homeless people into shelters and forcing them into labor. This was a very, very abusive a very, very abusive institution. I'm happy to talk with the senators here, anybody here, about the history of this. But it's not just a poorhouse. When you look into the amount of funding that is put into this and the requirements, the heavy requirements that this puts on counties, what amounts is you're going to have a camp of people where the counties simply do not have the resources, patrolled by police. How is this any different from a concentration camp? A concentration camp is a place where people are confined, usually without hearings and typically under harsh conditions, often as a result of their membership in a group which the government had identified as dangerous or undesirable. I have read Fortunato's discourse and rhetoric around homeless people. He has consistently, come out and called them undesirable in many ways. He might not use the exact word, but his discourse is completely disrespectful. This is de facto, if it were to come into existence, it would be a concentration camp.
Can we speak to the bill, please?
No, let me at least finish, Senator.
Yes, you may finish, but Ms. Spinoza, the comment was to speak to the bill rather than to the prime sponsor's words. And
yes, I am.
Please.
Well, that informs the context, but all in all, this is not a solution to housing. If you want a solution to housing, you must impose a rent moratorium, forgive rent for all renters in Washington, and have a housing first policy. There are plenty of empty homes throughout Washington that can be used for housing, and I simply do not see how this bill addresses that. It only makes the crisis worse, not better. And we are in the middle of a pandemic, and this is only going to kill more people. This is not going to save people.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. Do we have any questions for Ms. Spinoza? All right, well, thank you very much for everyone who signed in to testify. We very much appreciate your input. And with that, I'm going to close the hearing on Senate Bill 5107, and we are adjourned.